Good morning or good afternoon to everybody. This is Jerry Green from the Pacific Council on International Policy in Los Angeles. I want to welcome you to our event, which we're doing in partnership with World Affairs, which is the World Affairs Council in San Francisco. And they are spectacular partners. We do a lot of work together, so we're very happy to welcome you. As you all know, North America has been battered by the COVID-19 pandemic, with both Mexico and the United States recording some of the highest death tolls in the world. Unlike the US, Mexico and Canada don't have the capacity to manufacture vaccines at scale, and they also lack the resources to buy their way to the front of the line for imports. More than half of adults in the United States have already had at least one COVID-19 vaccination dose. And according to the CDC, we are likely to vaccinate significantly more of our population in the coming months. One of the issues that the White House has addressed recently is its willingness to export surplus vaccines to other countries that are in need of vaccine. Living in Los Angeles, which is 100 miles from the border, for us, what happens in Mexico is local politics. We share a border with Mexico. We don't share a border with New York or Washington or, the U.S. East Coast. So we are especially attentive to this issue. And Michael Camuñez, who is on the call today, who is a member of our board of directors and the head of the Pacific Council's Mexico initiative, has written a very, very widely circulated piece arguing that Mexico should be the recipient of surplus vaccine exported by the United States. And one could argue this altruistically, one could argue this as a humanitarian issue, but it's also, frankly, common sense. If we want to vaccinate Americans, we should be vaccinating Canadians and Mexicans who live on our borders, who are in our community. We share a border, a region with Mexico. And so I think it makes very good sense. And if you'd like to see Michael's piece, by all means, let us know and we will send you copies of it. I want to introduce our speakers, and let me begin with Eduardo Gonzaléz-Pier and Andrew Rudman, who are both from the Wilson Center. Two things about the Wilson Center. One is one of the first things I learned at the Pacific Council is the leading program on studying Mexico is at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And we've had a long and beneficial relationship with the Wilson Center dating back to Andrew Seeley, who then went to lead the Migration Policy Institute. So to have two speakers from the Wilson Center Mexico program is something that we really, really value. Just so you'll know, the audience will know, the Wilson Center has a new CEO, Ambassador Mark Green, no relation, the former head of AID. So if we are talking about vaccination diplomacy, global health, how to deal with pandemics, the Wilson Center is populated and now led by people who really are at the cutting edge of these issues and are well equipped to deal with this. I also want to thank Dr. Linda Lopez, who is a Pacific Council. I always say this as if this defines everybody's identity. I'm just very provincial. She's a Pacific Council member, but is someone of great accomplishment, used to work for the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, and she has graciously agreed to moderate today's panel. And finally, Michael Camuñez, who heads our Mexico initiative. So I'm going to get out of the way and let all of you get to work. Again, I want to thank the Wilson Center for participating. I want to thank our partners in San Francisco, World Affairs Council, for co-hosting this. And I want to thank both our speakers and our audience to join this. We are very, very engaged at the Pacific Council on vaccine diplomacy and health diplomacy. So we really will be talking about an area which is new but enormously important, up there with climate change as perhaps the two most significant issues of our time. So I want to turn it over to all of you and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I will be your moderator today. Thank you so much to the panel for joining us today as well. on a very important topic, vaccination diplomacy, as it relates to Mexico, but also the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. So why don't we get started with the conversation? For the audience, please know that we will be asking questions of the panelists. So if you want to drop in your questions in the chat box, we'll be sure to answer those, and the panelists can answer those as well. But let's get started. So Michael, I read your CNN op-ed probably 3 or 4 times just to make sure I got all the points right. But one of the things you reference in the op-ed is that, quote, when the U.S. sneezes, Mexico catches a cold. With countries all over the world turning to the U.S. for vaccine diplomacy, why should Mexico be first in line? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, if Mexico falls behind in vaccinations, what challenges does that pose for the United States?
Great. Well, thank you, Linda, for moderating. It's great to be with you again. And also just want to acknowledge my pleasure in being with my former colleague, Andrew Rudman, who just recently left my firm, Monarch, to take the leadership of the Mexico Institute. And with an old friend and dear colleague, Eduardo Gonzaléz-Pier, who, in addition to his Mexico Institute affiliation, is the former Deputy Secretary of Health in Mexico and a well-respected public health expert in Mexico and here in the United States. Eduardo, it's great to be with you. So, Linda, I'll try to address both questions at once because I think they're related. Why should Mexico be first, and what challenges, if it isn't, I think are very interconnected. Of course, the first thing I want to say is when I wrote the article 3 weeks ago, or however long ago it was, 4 weeks ago now, maybe. And I take no credit by saying this, but it wasn't clear what the U.S. posture on vaccine diplomacy would be. The United States had not yet made its intentions known. The Biden administration was still new in office and accumulating the stockpile of vaccines to be able to roll out. And I was very concerned, given the proximity of Mexico and our relationship, that Mexico needed to be prioritized quickly, and was delighted to see the administration follow suit. I think there are 5 reasons. I'll try to cover them quickly as to why we should prioritize Mexico. And I know that saying that, even as India suffers catastrophic illness and death, and other parts of South America, this is a global pandemic, and there's global need. But I guess the principle that my operating principle is what I'd call the oxygen mask rule, which is put on your mask first, make sure you're okay, and then take care of others. And just frankly, given how the proximate relationship and integration of our countries, as I'll get into, I think requires that we can't just look to the United States. We are part of North America. So I think first and foremost, there's a moral argument. We share a continent together, and it's the correct thing to do to look first to take care not only of ourselves, but of our immediate neighbors. And I think there's a compelling moral argument, but moral arguments don't tend to carry the day in politics. So I'm going to make 4 additional very specific arguments. First is just purely economic self-interest. Mexico, we share a 2,000-mile border with Mexico, but far beyond that, being adjacent to one another, we have a completely integrated and interdependent economy. And we know that since the passage of NAFTA, we don't just trade with Mexico, which is now our largest overall trading partner in the world. If you think about that, that's quite extraordinary for an economy the size of the United States. But we make things together and we co-produce, and those production lines and supply chains and value chains are so integrated. It'd be like looking at if you scan the human body and you saw the network of arteries and veins that connect the heart to all of its organs. That's pretty much how the United States and Mexico are connected, and it's two-way trade. It's not like we just depend on them for things. They also depend on us, and the trade in intermediate goods is essential. And the reality is, as we saw with the pandemic, the disruption of those critical supply chains can be devastating to the American economy. And so it's in our economic self-interest, if we want to compete, on the global stage. If we want to make a full economic recovery, we have to have our engine operating at full steam. And the only way that's going to happen is if we're able to continue to produce and manufacture and work collaboratively in critical industries. This is a massive, multi-billion dollar, Andrew, what is it, up to over $600 billion in two-way trade. And Mexico is a significant pull on the U.S. economy in terms of their demand for intermediate products that we produce. You know, the old adage about an American-made automobile in Detroit isn't true anymore. It's really North American automobiles that are produced and that are competitive, regardless of brand, whether it's American, Japanese, or other. So there's a compelling economic argument. Second, there's a very compelling public health consideration. We share, as I mentioned, a 2,000-mile permeable border with Mexico, and it's estimated that there's some 350 million lawful border crossings annually. Millions of Mexicans and Americans cross the border each way daily to visit and work and shop and trade and receive medical care and attend schools and visit family. And the truth is, the longer Mexico persists with an unvaccinated population, the worse off it'll be. Mexico is currently on pace to be about 8 months behind the United States in terms of overall vaccine penetration. So if you think about the risk of these variants developing, these lethal variants that our vaccines may or may not be effective against, I think it's a terrible risk to U.S. public health and to our shared public health. Third, there's a national security interest from a migration standpoint. Mexico is the primary transit route for thousands of migrants making their way to the United States for various reasons, which we can get into. And many of these migrants are coming from the poorest communities in the Northern Triangle and Central America, fleeing horrific circumstances. And most of them, frankly, have not been vaccinated. And as they travel and are exposed because of their wretched living conditions and tragic circumstances, it's a humanitarian crisis, but it's also a national security crisis and a public health crisis wrapped into one. And finally, I would say there's compelling geopolitical reasons for us to do this. The Chinese and the Russians have not been shy about promoting their vaccines to Mexico, and the Mexican government has been asking for help. And if they can't get the help from the United States, they're going to turn to Russia and China. My strong view is that this coming conflict with China, which I think is intensifying by the day and month, this economic conflict, hopefully it limits to that, can only be handled as a unified North American response. Frankly, we need to leverage mask diplomacy, being there for our friends and our economic partners when they need us most, and keep Mexico squarely on our side and not give inroads to Russia and China in our own backyard. So I think those are the high-level reasons that make for a compelling case. That's not to say we shouldn't do things elsewhere. That's not to say that we shouldn't contribute to the global effort to respond to the crisis in India, to the crisis in other parts of the world, including South America. But going back to my oxygen principle, we've got to take care of ourselves first so that we can take care of others. If we suffer a shutdown, the reverberating effects across the globe are catastrophic. And in that sense, economically speaking, when the U.S. suffers a mild recession, Mexico tends to go into a deep recession. I say from a public health standpoint, when the U.S. catches a cold, Mexico catches the flu. So let's make sure that we do everything we can to strengthen our neighbor and our friends to the south.
Thank you so much, Michael. The points that you made are definitely points that are very important for this conversation. I just wanted to get Andrew and Eduardo's reaction to the op-ed and to some of the points that you've just made, because you're absolutely right. There is a lot of interdependence that exists between the U.S. and Mexico. And it's not only around, the public health crisis that we're facing right now, but it's also a national security issue. It's also an issue of economic interdependence. So with that, Eduardo, Andrew, do you have any other thoughts or any other points that you'd like to make based on what Michael has just shared?
Linda, if I can step in here.
Sure, absolutely.
First of all, I totally agree with the Michael point of view and the idea that it goes beyond economic interest and self-interest. It is something that is more in terms of relationship building, goodwill, trust across communities. We're pretty much engaged and committed to go together for the longer term. And I think that the mutual cooperation across many types of agendas, whether it be migration, terrorist threats, other things, they all depend on communities and countries understanding each other and there being goodwill. And I think at this moment, there is a need for both President Biden and President Lopez Obrador to find a common dialogue and work among many things in the agenda. So I think vaccine diplomacy has an issue at stake. I would also add that it goes beyond pandemics and it goes beyond transmittable diseases. We share a common economic area, but we also share a common cultural area. And I would also add that we share a common epidemiological area. If you look at the health needs of the populations on the south part of the US border and the northern part of the Mexican country, they look very much alike. Even though the health systems are different, the per capita spendings are different, the way it's set up and access to quality care is different, they have the same type of health needs. And that is because when countries get together, they start behaving the same way in terms of lifestyles. And lifestyles lead to health conditions. So it is also about the integration of the health needs and the health practices of both communities on both sides. And I think that if you bring that common agenda together, it can start with vaccines, it can be about containing pandemics, but then it very easily flows into many other health needs of the population. And I think we should be looking farther ahead into how to create a healthier border, a healthier common agenda. And it might start with a very principle of helping each other with vaccination.
Great. Andrew, would you like to jump in?
I would add, I agree with Michael and Eduardo, and I think the way Michael lays out the reasons, it should be a no-brainer that I think you could say, helping to vaccinate Mexico and Canada is the same as vaccinating us here in the United States. And this, and like so many other issues, the border is a line on the map, sure, but the reality is, for most people day to day, it's nothing but a line on the border. There's so much interchange of people and goods back and forth across both our northern and southern borders that it really is in our interest, as Michael said, for us to be seeing it holistically. And I think, sort of picking up on what Eduardo was saying, and to use that cliche about never letting a crisis go to waste, what we need to do is make sure that we learn the lessons, and there are a number of lessons from this pandemic, so that while we can't prevent a future pandemic, we're better prepared. And if you look back at even some of what was written after the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, not everything that was recommended was acted upon. And hopefully, though inevitably a new pandemic, new challenges, but hopefully when there is another pandemic, people will be able to say, okay, they learned from 2020 and moved on and we're better prepared. Because I think we'd all agree that neither the US nor Mexico was particularly well prepared for COVID-19.
Hey, Linda, if
Yes,
I could add just one other point. I could imagine some people thinking, well, this is all fine and good, but Michael, to your point about the oxygen principle, let's make sure we vaccinate Americans first, right? And the one point I just want to make just very briefly is that there is no shortage. In fact, this summer, we are going to be awash in a surplus of vaccines. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I'm happy to get into. But there is no shortage of vaccines for Americans. And in fact, we have so much, not only to the vaccine production that we've already contracted to, but we have options for additional production. And there are additional vaccines from Europe, from France and Germany and elsewhere that that are high quality vaccines that have not yet even been approved by the FDA, FDA approval is imminent. There's going to be an abundance of vaccines. So there's just, in fact, we're already seeing underutilization. There's more vaccines than most states have the capacity to deploy. And there's certainly more vaccines than there's demand, given, unfortunately, the politicization of vaccinations. So I just want to make that point, because I think the whole premise of this argument is that, there's an abundance of vaccines, and there is, in fact, that.
That's a great point. And Michael, that you just mentioned, one of the things I forgot to mention to the audience and to the panel is that I'm currently working on a vaccination outreach campaign for the city of Los Angeles. We're not ready to launch yet, but I can say that, we are seeing on the ground vaccine hesitancy when it comes to Latino populations, African-American populations, other populations that just have these myths about the vaccination and or aren't able to access it for whatever reason, because they have to go on to on the internet to book their appointments. So there's a lot of different, I guess, quote unquote, barriers or challenges to getting the vaccination. But I think you're absolutely right. There's not going to be a shortage. There's no shortage of supply. The real question is, how do we address that, even in the United States context, in terms of making sure that people actually get vaccinated in the first place? So since we're on this topic of focused primarily right now on vaccinations, I wanted to turn to Eduardo to learn more about your sort of how you're seeing on the ground in Mexico. What are things looking like in terms of the vaccination rates in Mexico? What are some of your observations that you're seeing at this time?
Yes, Linda. I think Michael summarized it very well. We're at least 6 months behind in terms of the vaccination schedule. So far, if you look at the numbers, there's about 13 million people that have been vaccinated at least once in Mexico. That's about 10% of the population. About 6%, that's 8 million, have been vaccinated with a full 2 doses. And we're vaccinating around 300,000 per day. The reason why this is less than 1/10 of what we're observing in the US is because of lack of vaccines. The pace could be much faster, but it is just not, there's not enough vaccines being rolled out or arriving in Mexico. Let me make a point here, which can be a bit uncomfortable. But China and Russia are farther ahead in the vaccination diplomacy game. And just recently, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, we had our foreign secretary, Mr. Ebrard, go visit Russia, go visit China, asking for vaccines and getting some pledges, while at the same time, like Michael was saying, there's a potential surplus of vaccines just across the border. And important to say that a lot of Mexicans have been vaccinated in the U.S. already, just because the restrictions on residency are very are not being applied. So it's already taking place, and I think that we're getting these mixed signals of vaccine diplomacy from countries like China and Russia, when I think what we should be doing is centering the focus on more on a regional. Well, the interests are much more concentrated with Canada and the US and trying to look for allies which have a lower capacity to deliver vaccines. And it just does not make sense to be playing those sort of games. Anyways, I know that the US has already pledged vaccines, especially the AstraZeneca, which is not already registered in the US, but is registered in Mexico. That is a good supply. And I'm hoping that there will be a much larger process of donations, or market doesn't have to be donations. I think Mexico can afford the vaccines. It's just a matter of getting a hold on a reliable supply. But I think that we should speed up our vaccination schedule. Right now, it is that we'll have a significant coverage by mid-2022. That is almost more than a year away. And I think we should aim at least to have a significant number of vaccines covered, especially for the high-risk population before the end of this year. And I think that can be made possible with much larger cooperation and commitments between both countries.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, for sharing that. And I just wanted to add to what you were saying with the statistics. So you're saying 10% more or less of Mexicans have been vaccinated, and that is at least once. And that's a population of about, just for context for the audience, it's a population of about 126 million or so, right? So you can see that 10% vis-a-vis the overall population is pretty significant when you think about the percentages in comparison to even other countries as well. So
it's about 6 days of vaccinations in the United States.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, right. So, I mean, I think that to put it into context, I think that's a really important number and percentage to acknowledge, and also in terms of the population. So, Andrew, Eduardo, you recently wrote a report focused on health, and it also has some recommendations as well. And I wanted to ask, we have a lot of these issues that Michael has already mentioned on, the economic interdependence, issues of national security, migration. But when it comes to the health policy agenda, what are some of the things that you found in the report that you just published, and recommendations?
Sure. Linda, as you're alluding to, we identified a number of areas where there could be greater cooperation. One that we didn't talk about in the report, but I think is really relevant to this conversation, has to do with, I think we need from the US and Mexico and Canada a commitment in the future that the countries won't engage or implement any border restrictions or control mechanisms when it comes to the export of PPE and vaccines and that nature. In the case of vaccines, there was a restriction imposed by the Trump administration on export of vaccine that only expired at the end of March, I believe, which is why Pfizer has just now started to ship US-made vaccine to Mexico. They had been shipping from Europe, which didn't have that restriction. There was also a restriction on the export of N95 masks. Canada had purchased a number of masks from 3M, and 3M was not allowed to ship those. What ultimately happened is 3M has made a commitment to produce in Canada so that in the event there's ever that kind of mechanism again, Canadians won't be denied access. And while that's great, the investment in Canada is great for creating Canadian jobs, I think that's not ultimately the policy prescription that we should be looking for. We should be looking for commitments that we won't do that, not creating reasons for companies to have to invest in other countries. It sort of undermines the whole concept of North American production. One other area I'll mention where that we talk about in our paper is a revitalization of the Border Health Commission, which in 2015 wrote a report identifying 5 areas that ought to be focused on by the Secretaries of Health and the Departments of Health in both countries. And those included chronic and degenerative disease, infectious disease, child and maternal health, mental health and addiction, and injury prevention. And at least 3 of those were exacerbated by COVID-19. So one of the things that we've suggested in the paper is that we need the leadership in both governments, the Biden and AMLO administrations, to reinvigorate that mechanism and ideally reestablish a work plan going forward, probably tied to the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. But the point being, we have a lot of common challenges, and there ought to be leadership from the federal level encouraging the 2 governments and the administrations to work together on those.
Thank you. Eduardo, did you want to add anything to what Andrew has just mentioned?
Yeah, I think Andrew summarized. This paper talks about at least 8 areas of collaboration. Many of these are not new, but they do need to be refreshed and relaunched. But let me add something, Linda, that Andrew mentioned, and I think it's very concerning. This pandemic, especially early last year, revealed a set of very concerning protectionist measures that were not there. They happened slowly. They faded away, but I think we should pay attention because it's not very common that you get them. It was on both sides of the border. It was in the U.S. A mention to the War Protection Act.
Mhm.
It's Defense Protection Act. When it comes to production of certain equipment, there was, I think, the case with ventilators and the idea that the U.S. This is a piece of legislation that goes back to the 50s, and you can intervene and protect and avoid shipping anything outside of the U.S. and reconvert the industry. It was also the case, and it's important to mention that Mexico hosts a huge capacity of production by U.S. firms of devices and equipment, which supplies not only the U.S., but the rest of the world. And at some point, some Mexican governors, border governors, were talking about the capacity of interfere with that. And potentially, I think it was also the case of ventilators that were in short supply in Mexico. So those sentiments are there. And I'm not sure that we have the right structures to deal with them. So I think we should pay attention of what kind of renewal of regulations should be put in place to allow for certainty in these cases that there's credibility, there's a rule of law, and in case of these extraordinary circumstances, it is a clear procedure of what can and cannot be done.
Right.
So
Michael,
I think that was unusual.
yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I mean, I think we saw some mass diplomacy happening with cities too, right? When at the height of the pandemic, there were individual cities that were creating these sort of, I guess, partnerships and contracts basically to export masks in places that were in high need. So I think there is something there, Eduardo, that you've pinpointed that is really important to acknowledge. Michael, did you want to jump in and
Yeah,
add to that? Yes.
I think this is a really critical topic that Andrew and Eduardo have identified. It goes beyond regulatory cooperation. It really gets to the guts of sort of emergency planning and response, which makes it a homeland security or a national security, domestic security issue. In the United States and Mexico, as you recall, when the pandemic first happened, there were certain sectors or industries that were deemed critical. Everybody was ordered to shut down, but certain industries were allowed to remain open because they were deemed to be in the national security interest of the United States. And that was frankly politicized a little bit on both sides. But the most important problem is that there was not alignment between the United States and Mexico. And because of what I've just described earlier about this interdependence and interconnection between the two countries, imagine a situation where you have a medical device manufacturer in one country or the other who's reliant upon inputs from the other country, but one factory on one side of the border is deemed essential and is kept open. The other factory on the other side of the border is not, and it's shut down. And that happened quite a bit. And that created huge disruptions in the supply chain. So sometimes when we mention supply chain issues, people's eyes tend to roll and it sounds really wonky. These are life and death issues in some circumstances. So I think what we need is a master plan between the United States and Mexico and Canada, anticipating the next big crisis. It doesn't have to be a pandemic. It could be an act of war. It could be a climate emergency. It could be any number of circumstances that are disruptive to the economy, to the global economy. But there's a need for, I think, this master plan. Number two, there's this crisis also laid bare the lack of regulatory cooperation between the Mexican FDA, which is known as COFEPRIS, and the U.S. FDA is really lacking. Historically, COFEPRIS has gotten better and better and has become even internationally respected. But unfortunately, in recent years, that stature, I think you'd agree, Eduardo, has declined. And there's a lot of, and Andrew, you spent a lot of time studying COFEPRIS. There's been a lot of institutional problems there. We need to have the FDAs of the three countries totally aligned from a regulatory perspective when it comes to pandemic and other national emergency responses. There were times, for example, I was approached by certain industries or certain even government agencies about, Eduardo mentioned, ventilators. I was trying at one time to help some ventilators get imported into Mexico, and these ventilators could have been really useful. They were produced in the United States. They had FDA emergency use authorization, but the Mexican COFEPRIS wouldn't approve them. And so these life-saving ventilators ended up not getting shared with Mexico, which is terrible. And the last thing I'd say is this pandemic has also laid bare the reality that we have an extreme centralization and concentration of production capacity for personal protective equipment and critical first responder equipment in Southeast Asia, with nitrile gloves, with masks in China, with you name it. The production capacity is greatly skewed toward Asia. And there's a strong desire to bring that manufacturing back, not just to the United States, but also to Mexico and to the region. But to make that happen, you've got to smooth the way and give investors a lot of confidence that if they build those plants, they're going to be successful. There's going to be domestic demand. So there's a lot of public policy that needs to be aligned between the two countries that's not being done. I was very heartened to hear the two U.S. presidents, after their latest bilateral, announce that they're going to relaunch the high-level economic dialogue, which was a cabinet-level platform that is intended to let the two countries work out these strategic issues. I had the privilege of working on that and helping actually to create it when I was Assistant Secretary of Commerce with President Obama, and it was very successful. It was chaired by Vice President Biden. They've announced their intention to recreate that, and I think one of the key agenda items for the HLED will be this public health diplomacy.
That's fantastic, Michael. Thank you for sharing that, which leads me to the next question, which is very connected, and that is this is for all the panelists too. How do you see the bilateral relationship changing from a Trump administration to a new Biden administration, and what's changed in this sort of transition in leadership?
Linda, I'll jump in. I know Michael and Eduardo will have thoughts as well, but I think most significantly the relationship under the Trump administration with Mexico was pretty transactional, pretty much focused on migration and a little bit on trade, and very much driven from the White House. And I think what you are seeing to some extent, and we'll see even more as Michael references the HLED, is a broader, more institutional and more traditional relationship where at the cabinet level, we will talk to the Mexican government about a whole host of issues, much broader than just one or two. With that, I think come far more opportunities for cooperation, like in issues like health, but frankly, also more opportunities for conflict and for disagreement. The broader the agenda is that we have, the more likely we're going to run into areas of disagreement or challenge. Whereas I think with the Trump-AMLO relationship, it was really focused on migration. And as I said, on a very transactional approach. Mexico reduced migration, and the Trump administration didn't really engage on other issues. And I think we've already seen with the climate summit that the Biden administration is going to have a broader view of where the U.S. and Mexico need to collaborate.
Thank you. Eduardo, would you like to
Yes,
add?
Linda, if I can add up to what Andrew mentioned, I think we have to work on the commonalities that both presidents have in terms of priorities and agendas. And I think there's more that it seems. And I would point out to both countries and leaders' concerns with safety nets, social spending, the concern of not leaving the poor behind. I think there's a lot to work with that. And of course, health has a lot to do with creating capacities and helping the poor reach their potential. So I think that this pandemic can lead, like Michael was mentioning, into this master plan. The master plan, of course, has many angles. One of them is regulatory, but one of them should also be the capacity to mutually invest in more health capacities. Both countries have major challenges in their health systems. They can learn from each other. They can do a lot of cross-country agenda. And I think that this master plan can be a way of reaching common ground and working together for the for the future. I would add that this is not the first time we have a pandemic, and this is not the first time that we bring together experts and policymakers to work. I think 2009 was a good example. Things got worked out. Some things did well, some things didn't. I think one thing we cannot afford this time around is A, not doing anything about it, and B, trying to not be naive about what can and cannot be accomplished. We seem to have very short memory. People like to forget right away as soon as the pandemic is under control, move on to other things. And I don't think we should let that happen. I do think that while we have this opportunity and we have a focus on it, we should make sure that the structures of constant dialogue around health, around common agendas are set in place. And this is very long lasting. I would just finalize by saying that after 2009, both countries invested a lot in pandemic preparedness and control. In fact, looking at the Global Health Security Index, which ranks countries according to how prepared they are to face the next pandemic, the US ranked number 1 in terms of pandemic preparedness, and Mexico ranked 28th, but it was the 4th in the region, in the Latin American region. And something just didn't work out. I think Mexico and the US, at least on the initial 2020 response, I think they were badly hit and there were some flaws in the response. I think we should take this opportunity to understand what happened. A lot of the failures are common to both countries. I think we should understand those, we should look at them, and we should try to learn from those experiences for the future. So the agenda is very rich, it's very necessary, and I hope it's put in motion the sooner the better.
Michael?
Yeah, I've been sitting here trying to think about how I want to hit, what angle of approach I want to take on that, because it's a really complicated question. I think that in many respects, I agree with Eduardo that and Andrew that it's going to be a more institutional approach, and that there is, Eduardo, there should be a very large common agenda. In fact, I was just recently with the new Mexican ambassador in Washington this past week, and that's a big part of our conversation was around just how much in common the Biden agenda, domestic agenda, and foreign policy agenda aligns with what are AMLO's professed values about reducing income inequality, lifting up the poor, creating opportunities for the working and middle class, reducing corruption, and et cetera. The reality, however, is that in politics, people matter. People are policy, and leadership matters. And I think the reality is the jury is still out as to what we're dealing with. I think in Joe Biden, he's got a very long track record and is a very known commodity and a very traditional approach to the relationship. I think he's already shown in his leadership, his interest in the region. He's visited the country many times. He shares AMLO's deep commitment to addressing the root causes of poverty and migration in the Northern Triangle. I think he shares AMLO's commitment around some of his broader societal goals in terms of, as Biden might put it in Biden speak, a foreign policy for the working class or the middle class. I think he shares a commitment to deepening U.S. trade. AMLO is a bit of a still unknown quantity, though. I mean, I think we're still trying to understand, notwithstanding his professed goals and values, he's actually governing in a manner that's not always consistent with those professed values, and he's sending signals. His government is sending signals that have created a lot of heartburn in the United States in terms of the business climate in Mexico, the rule of law, the perception of I'm sure people that follow the Mexico relationship saw Jorge Castañeda's article in the op-ed in the New York Times challenging the Biden administration to be more assertive, contrary to conventional wisdom, about in holding the Mexican government accountable in what he characterized as a slide toward authoritarianism. I think his article had many important points to consider. I'm not endorsing that point of view, but I'm just saying that there's a lot of room for conflict in this relationship that's going to have to be managed very, very carefully. That said, I'm confident that this administration in the United States, understands the complexity of the relationship. We haven't touched on security, and there are a whole bunch of other issues that play themselves out. I do think, since we're talking about health, that health is one of those areas that I think creates tremendous opportunity. I think with the right kind of leadership, and Eduardo, I'm hoping you and Andrew and others will provide that thought leadership, we can construct an agenda, a pillar of the agenda that's very constructive. And I think the two leaders need to point to some successes, to places where we are working, where our interests are totally aligned, and where the public can see evidence of that collaboration. I think that's in our mutual interest. So I do think health and public health diplomacy is an area rich with opportunities in what might otherwise be a more complicated and difficult relationship.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. So we have a question from the chat box for the panelists today. And the question is, can the panel provide some insight into the dialogues between the Biden and AMLO administrations over border security and vaccine requests? So picking up on what you just said, Michael, can you share a little bit more about the border security issues as well, and answering the question?
Well, I'll take a stab at it, and I don't in my business reveal sources, but I will say this: I was encouraged having just been in Washington this entire past week and touching base with some friends in and out of the administration. I was encouraged by a couple of things. Number one, I had gone into my visit believing, kind of having an instinct that the relationship between Biden and AMLO was not as warm, and this is a really technical term here, as I would like it to be. Often you see the enthusiasm between Biden and Trudeau in Canada. Mm-hmm. Their bilat just kind of conveyed this traditional warmth and engagement and enthusiasm. And at least my perception, and I think many Mexico watchers' perception of the bilat between AMLO and Biden, their first official bilat, which was virtual, the impression that was left was that it was, I don't want to say frosty, but not, they didn't give each other, as we say in Spanish, a gran abrazo, a big warm hug. Part of that, I think, is due to AMLO's just personality and his own lived political experience. He was very slow, one of the last leaders to recognize the Biden win, and he just kind of sent a lot of goofy signals during the transition between Trump and Biden. And some very controversial things happened, including with the arrest of General Cienfuegos and his subsequent release in Mexico, the new law that was passed requiring foreign agents to register, and other things that are going to impede collaboration between the countries on law enforcement. That said, I was very encouraged to hear that the bilat was actually much more constructive and much better than it was perceived publicly, that there was more kind of warmth. And a lot of that, I think, is a credit to President Biden. He talked to AMLO. He was wearing a rosary around his wrist that he had used and had obtained when he visited the National Cathedral, the Cathedral of Our Lady of Virgen of Guadalupe, mm-hmm. which is of huge symbolic importance in Mexico. It's a rosary that he used to pray when his son, Bo, died, and he talked to the president about that. It was very personal in that sense, which is very Biden. So I was encouraged by that. It was also the case that AMLO was very direct about asking for help with vaccines. In fact, if you listen to the transcript from that first meeting as they were ushering the press out, and they both made their opening statements, at the very end of AMLO's opening statement, he specifically asks the president for help on vaccines. And the president says, we'll get to that, basically. So I think the subject has been there. There's a lot of perception that Biden is offering to help with vaccines in exchange for Mexico's commitment on the border to stem the flow of migration. I think that's a misread of the relationship. I think that's a very cynical and callous view of what's actually happening. I think there's a bona fide interest. I think the president, given what he inherited with the sort of lack of a rollout of the vaccine in the United States. I think the White House's first priority was to make sure that the rollout was successful in the US and that there was, in fact, an abundance of supply, because I think they knew that if they started talking about shipping vaccines off globally before Americans were vaccinated, they'd face a revolt. So I think they played their hands right. I think they were always intending, frankly, to spread the health, so to speak. But I think that there's also the case that the president's biggest vulnerability is this migration issue, this border crisis. And there's a lot of criticism being directed towards the White House at this point. And it is true that the White House, that the U.S. government needs the Mexican government's help. And there is something to be said. There's some reasonable minds can differ on the timing of the administration's approach on this, but I don't think they're linked. But I do think that I don't think they're linked directly, but I do think that they are discussed concurrently. And I think there is you will see, I think, each side trying to help each other the way best that it can. And clearly the U.S., I mean, my only disappointment with the U.S. vaccine policy towards Mexico is so far we've been talking about lending AstraZeneca supply that we can't use ourselves because it's not even FDA approved yet, when in reality we should be mobilizing a much larger deployment of vaccines from Pfizer and from Moderna, and possibly accelerating the approval of some of the other pending, like Sanofi and other vaccines, and getting those to Mexico as quickly as possible, because this 8 or 9 month lag that Eduardo and I are discussing is terrible from a public health standpoint. And it's just the right environment to allow a mutation of the virus. And all we need to add sort of a doomsday scenario to the current border crisis is for there to be documented cases of mutant strains coming across the border. So you can imagine the Oaxaca variant or the Sinaloa variant or whatever it may be. And that's all we need for there to be mass hysteria added to already mass hysteria about the border crossings. And that would be to the grave disadvantage of the human lives, the children and families, principally, who are coming across the border.
Thank you, Michael. Having spent a lot of time working on migration issues, also on the U.S.-Mexico border, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You know, the migrant issue right now is set front and center. And I think if we could go beyond that and really create more of a frame that is, or even a narrative that is beyond that, I think we would be in a better position and a better posture to do more work around the public health issue, vaccinations, the economic, interdependence issue. So I think you're absolutely right. There's been such a heavy focus on that, and not so much of a focus on these other issues that I think are so important for us to one, acknowledge, but also to address in terms of policy solutions. So thank you for sharing that. We do have another, and I don't know if others want to jump in at this point. We have another question. Eduardo, Andrew, did you want to jump into that question, or shall we move on to the next one? Andrew?
Yeah, I think you're fine to move on. Okay,
let's move on. Okay, we have a question from Dr. Sam Stratton, a friend of the Pacific Council on International Policy. And the question is, what is the role of the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, at the border? And has that division of the World Health Organization been active in coordination of vaccine sharing and an organized international North American approach to COVID-19? Eduardo, I don't know if you want to take that one, or Andrew or Michael.
I would just be very brief. So PAHO has been very active in border health. They've published extensively. They've had a set of very good proposals. And I would say that PAHO has taken a very significant role in Mexico in terms of advising policy for health. We've gone through major changes in the health system. Major reforms from last administration were repealed. Other institutions were put in place. The whole procurement process was overhauled with mixed results. So I think PAHO has both a good opportunity to influence policy in Mexico and has good knowledge of border health. We still need to bring that down to more specific activities, and I'm hoping that PAHO will take a more active role when the time comes to look again at border health, especially with a focus of post-pandemic collaboration.
I would just add that, I mean, PAHO is a wonderful institution, as is the World Health Organization. But the kind of North American leadership that's required here has to come from the North American leaders themselves. And so while PAHO can play an important role in facilitating and facilitating collaboration and whatnot, the leadership can't come from PAHO. The U.S., neither the U.S. nor Mexico nor Canada is going to follow PAHO's lead. The leadership has to come from the United States, from Mexico, and from Canada, from the leaders themselves. And I really hope that we'll soon be seeing scheduled a new North American Leaders Summit, which is very, very important towards these ends, because it's very needed. And I should just say that I think the new Mexican ambassador, Esteban Moctezuma, understands these issues, is very committed to strengthening this relationship, and I think is going to be very good in helping strengthen the bilateral relationship.
Thank you so much, Eduardo and Michael. We still have, I think, one possibility of one more question. So if people want to put in the chat box another question for the panelists, feel free to do that. I have my last question for all the panelists before we answer those questions in the chat box. So, I mean, I think we've had a very fruitful and robust conversation on some of the main issues around vaccine diplomacy and the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, and, you know, moving forward for the future, you know, what we envision and what we can reimagine in terms of that relationship. And my question for the panelists is, you know, we've already identified some pressing issues that the Biden administration is facing right now. But what do you think will be the most pressing issue that the Biden administration will need to solve in this bilateral relationship? So I'm thinking, for example, once we figure out the migrant issue at the border, you know, what's next, do you think, on the agenda? Or how do you visualize or think about some of the policy issues that will need to be addressed?
I'll give it a shot, Linda, very short. I don't have a direct answers.
Or crystal ball?
No, but let me tell you something.
Yeah,
and I think you should ask this question in a month's time.
Okay.
So we know that AMLO has been very good. He's shown to be excellent at reading the national sentiment. His campaign hit on the right spots, and I think that's what brought him to power. Second, I think he's shown to be a pragmatist. And he's had some reality checks, and I think he's sorted things out, sometimes better than others. So I think we're going to having our biggest election on the 6th of June.
Yes.
It's going to be a contested election. There's a lot of polls out there, but something we learned from polls is that sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And my feeling is that whatever the polls say, whatever people reveal on the 6th of June is going to make the president and his leaders reconsider the U.S.-Mexico relationship in a very pragmatic way, because what you have is an even more important election coming up in 2024. So that's why I say, in a sense, I think the dialogue, the more significant dialogue and the agreements are probably to come once we have an election and we understand the national sentiment and interpret it in a very pragmatic way.
So that's a great point that you make, Eduardo. So maybe we can do this all over again in a month or so, right? Have this conversation in a month.
Nothing will change. Probably everything will change.
Yeah, you never know. You never know. Well, good. Let's see, Michael, did you want to share anything with it's a big question, I know, but
yeah,
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Andrew also wanted to get in. So
Sure.
Andrew, I've done a lot of talking. Why don't you jump in?
So
If you have
it is a big, yeah. it is a big question, Linda. And, I think based on the topic of this conversation, which was health and vaccine diplomacy, I think that's probably not the next big issue. I think, as Eduardo points out, beyond the election, I think there will be some issues related to energy policy and environment and climate change, which is obviously a high priority for the Biden administration. Some of the policies being pursued in Mexico with respect to energy seem to contradict Mexico's Paris commitments, or at least make more difficult meeting those commitments. So I think that is an issue where there will be conversation and focus, and tied to that to some extent, USMCA, the free trade agreement, comes up on its 1-year anniversary on July 1st. And I think based on what USTR Catherine Tai has said lately, there will be some conversations about compliance with the agreement and really completion of implementation. It is, after all, not even a year old. So I would say energy, environment, and USMCA are probably the next big issues. But as Eduardo said, beyond the election.
I would just take it up, and I know we're running short on time here, but I would just take it up one notch and to sort of pan out a little bit. If I were advising the White House, I would tell them the most urgent thing that the White House needs to achieve, beyond any particular policy, climate, energy, health, whatever, is convincing AMLO that the United States is a faithful and loyal partner, and that Mexico needs to see and view its partnership with the United States as in its own self-interest and for the good of the Mexican people. My fear is that AMLO is deeply mistrustful of his own structures, his own democracy, his own institutions, because of how he perceives he's been treated as a political candidate in his political career, with some valid criticism, by the way. But I also worry that he's fundamentally a nationalist. He's fundamentally, about promoting Mexican sovereignty and Mexican independence from everybody. And my fear is that he will take that too far, and that will really not, that he'll miss the opportunity to collaborate with the United States in the building of the 21st century economic infrastructure and enterprise across a host of issues. And I think that the challenge for the United States is to convince AMLO that we are reliable partners, that we share values with him. That doesn't mean we can't disagree or hold him accountable, but that he is better off, and the people he cares most about in Mexico are better off being closely aligned with the United States than going it on their own, or much less aligning with others. So I think that's the most imperative agenda item, in my opinion.
Well, thank you so much. It's 1:02. We've had a very rich conversation. I want to thank Michael, Eduardo, Andrew for joining us today, for lending your expertise to this very important conversation. I also want to thank Elise, who's been behind the scenes, working the chat box and helping to organize and curate this group of experts today. And also a huge thanks to the Pacific Council on International Policy and World Affairs for hosting this timely topic and event today. Thank you so much.
Linda, thank you for moderating. Great job. And thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
Great to be
Michael,
with
great
you
seeing
all.
you.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Great to see you guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.